Look, we have fresh, buttery popcorn. Okay, I have to admit, I can't believe I'm having to do this one, but this one is pretty bad. Today, we're going to do a popcorn review of Frank Turek's channel, where he recently posted the video, 8 Lines of Evidence from Egypt for the Exodus, on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Today, we are doing a popcorn review of one of Frank Turek's videos on the Exodus in Egypt. Now, I've seen dozens of videos on the Exodus, and many are defending the early Exodus date position. And normally I would not respond to such videos, but this one struck me as particularly bad. Okay? Now, my problem with Turek's video is not just that it's full of misinformation, but there's also some poor thinking in it as well. And this is the sort of discourse I would have expected from the likes of Ron Wyatt or David Down. However, what makes Turek exceptional here is that he's a big-name apologist with a large YouTube channel that has over 600,000 subscribers. He has influence. He is also leading a tour to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, where he supposedly is going to be showing people this evidence. So he's invested himself as a subject matter expert. The problem is that you cannot lead a tour of something you really don't understand well. Now, we see on his screen here, he calls himself Dr. Frank Turek. So let's give a little background on Turek himself. He has an apologetics ministry called Cross-Examined. That's a good thing. Thumbs up to that. He holds a master's degree in public administration. Okay, not so clear how that applies to Egypt or the Exodus. Okay. And he also holds a D.Min from Southern Evangelical Seminary. Now, for those of you who don't know, the D.Min is sometimes called the easy doctorate. It's a professional doctorate. It was created so that pastors can call themselves doctor to make more money. It's not a research doctorate. It's basically you do a few courses, you write a little case study, and they give you a piece of paper that says doctor. Okay? So Turek here is not a subject matter expert on either the Exodus or Egypt. Now, that's not necessarily a problem when you just make YouTube videos. But he's sort of taken the next step, where he's going to lead people to sites in Egypt, sites that he really doesn't understand. So we are going to get into this video that I think is very problematic. So with that said, we are going to begin our review of 8 Lines of Evidence from Egypt for the Exodus.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to have the privilege to lead a group to Egypt and Saudi Arabia looking at the evidence for the Exodus. And I don't know about you, but you've probably heard...
Okay. Now, this first 16 seconds is super telling right here. If Turek is leading a group of people to not just Egypt, but Saudi Arabia, that can't be good. It means that Turek has not only drunk the Titus Candy Kool-Aid, he's also drunk the Wyatt Kool-Aid also. This can't end well. Ron Wyatt was the guy who proposed the crossing at the Gulf of Aqaba near Nuweiba Beach. Okay? So Turek has not just bought into the early Exodus stuff here, but also to some very, very strange theories by well-known conman, huckster, and heretic Ron Wyatt.
In general, scholars say, there's really no evidence for the Exodus. Well, we've actually covered on this program before with archaeologist Dr. Titus Kennedy.
Yep, Kennedy. That explains a lot. Now, Kennedy is a Syro-Palestinian archaeologist. He specialized in the demographics of the Late Bronze Age. He's not an Egyptologist. And when it comes to handling the Egyptological material, his handling of that source material is close to incompetent. Please see the card above if you want to watch my debate with Titus Kennedy.
That there is plenty of evidence for the Exodus if you know where to look and if you're looking at the right time.
Ooh. Quote, if you know where to look and you are looking at the right time, end quote. Anyone who says this, this is always a bad start. I wish I had $1 for every time an early dater said that. You can pretty much translate that catchphrase as, quote, I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm going to make the evidence fit my ideological assumptions no matter what, end quote. Now, when it comes to evidence should guide you to the date, not the date guide you to the evidence. And the reason is because dates in ancient history are vague at best. And this is because of discrepancies in calendar systems, regnal years, and intercalation. So there's some really, really good reasons why you want to follow the evidence to the date instead of having a preconceived notion of what the date is and then forcing the evidence to fit that date no matter what.
What I want to do in this program is give evidence from credentialed archaeologists that it appears the Hebrews were in Egypt prior to 1446 BC.
First, saying, quote, the Hebrews were in Egypt prior to 1446 BC, end quote, is loaded language. Hebrews is a rather vague ethnonym. Does this mean Asiatic Semites? Could be. Does this mean Hapiru? Could be. Does this mean people who spoke the Hebrew language? Hebrew can mean any of those things. So it's not a term that's normally used by, as he says, credentialed archaeologists in reference to early Israelite culture. The other problem here is that when Turek mentions credentialed archaeologist, he almost certainly doesn't mean credentialed Egyptologist. Egyptologists are the subject matter experts when it comes to Egypt, not Syro-Palestinian archaeologists. And really what Turek is falling back on is the materials of Titus Kennedy, who is a Syro-Palestinian archaeologist. He's not an Egyptologist. He has no training in Egyptology. So I have extreme doubts that Turek has ever enlisted the help of an Egyptologist when it comes to the Israelites in Egypt.
Say why 1446 BC? I'll get to it in a minute. And I don't think we'll get to it today, but in a later program, we will also point out that they left Egypt about that time and went to what was then called Canaan. Later, of course, it became Israel.
My guess is Turek is going to use the same debunked arguments for his early date view that every early dater does. Okay, now we're not really going to talk about those views. We've done lots of videos on that, and if you want to see more arguments on that and how they've been completely discredited, please see the card above.
Well, we're going to look at this one. Is 1 Kings 6, chapter 1. 1 Kings 6, chapter 1 says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, i.e. the Exodus, the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So Solomon is beginning to build his temple essentially 480 years after the Exodus. Now, when you do all the math, that turns out to be 1446 BC.
Now, we've covered this many times on this channel, and Turek here is making the same mistake that as other early daters do. The 480th year is an idiom for an extended long period of time. But if you do the naive math to derive 1446 BC, you have the Israelites entering Canaan in 1406 BC. Yet, in circa 1347 BC, the Amorites still dominate and are expanding their dominance across Canaan. Yet, the Bible tells us that the Amorite Confederacy was broken up by the 5th year of the conquest. That's an archaeological contradiction, which the naive math calculation simply can't reconcile.
What evidence do we have that the Israelites were in, the Hebrews were in that area, Egypt, prior to 1446? I'm going to go through 8.
Yeah, there's evidence that Asiatic Semites were in Egypt prior to 1446, but also after that too. And that's not something that Frank here is going to account for.
The first line of evidence is that we have paintings of migrating Semites in a pharaoh's tomb. This is called the Ben Hassan painting in Khnophotep II's tomb. I don't know if I pronounced his name right, a pharaoh. It's got an odd spelling, KHNUMHOTEP II.
No, he didn't pronounce it correct. It's Khnumhotep. And he wasn't a pharaoh. Not a pharaoh, a nomarch, a hereditary governor. Okay? So, not only does he get the name wrong, and that's forgivable, because some of these names are difficult to pronounce, but he doesn't get the position right. He doesn't get the biography of the man correct. So, off to a great start here.
And this guy reigned in let me get his exact reign here because that is important. It looks like we're talking about the period. I don't have his exact reign, but we're talking about the Middle Kingdom. So that'd be from about 1938 BC to about 1630 BC, somewhere in that range, that 300-year range, that this particular painting is from, and the Middle Kingdom anyway. And it's found in this tomb. It's a panel painting on the tomb. Actually, here's the reign. I have it here. He reigned from 1911 BC to 1870 BC. So in his tomb, obviously just after this, and by the way, this tomb was discovered in 1964 in Egypt. And this particular tomb depicts nomadic Semites migrating to Egypt with children and livestock in tow with them. So this would support the biblical migration of the 12 tribes of Israel to Egypt, who of course were herdsmen, they were shepherds, and they settled in the Goshen pastures.
Oh boy, this is bad. Okay, let's get some of the basics out of the way and then let's look at the painting itself. The tomb was not discovered in 1964. The tomb has actually been known since antiquity, but it was published by Percy Newberry in 1893. Okay, so this is not a new discovery by any stretch of the imagination. Now, these are not Semitic Asiatics that were migrating to Goshen. In the lower frame of the relief, you can see one of the Egyptians handing the migrants' entry document to Khnumhotep II. There's actually writing on that document, and that document states that they are coming to Egypt to mine precious stones. So they're not shepherds. They're not coming here to pasture herds. They're essentially migratory workers who are coming in to Egypt to do mining operations, find some precious stones, sell them back to the Egyptians, and then move on. So they're not part of that migratory group. In fact, the sons of Jacob are going to enter into Egypt much, much later than these migrants. Okay? These migrants date to the Middle Kingdom, while the sons of Jacob, they're going to date to the Second Intermediate Period. So Turek misrepresents what this painting is showing. These are Asiatic Semites, but they're not the sons of Jacob, they're not Israelites, and they're not going to Goshen.
The painting, and as I say, we'll put it in the YouTube version of this podcast. These Semites are wearing these different patterns and bright colors of clothing, which of course were consistent with Joseph's colorful coat from Genesis chapter 37, verse 3.
Okay, the use of varicolored tunics is consistent with Joseph's coat. That's granted. But this seems to be a common feature of Semitic Levantine cultures. So this just means that there wasn't anything particularly special about Joseph having a varicolored tunic. It just seems to be a feature of Semitic culture.
Now, this is, of course, all circumstantial evidence, but it is quite interesting that we have a migration into Egypt at the time the Bible is telling us that the Hebrews did go to Egypt.
Not quite. Now, we have to understand that there were several waves of Semite migration into Egypt. There was one wave during the First Intermediate Period, as well as a second wave during the Second Intermediate Period. The Ben Hassan relief takes place during the Middle Kingdom, which is between the First and Second Intermediate Periods. Joseph entering Egypt was during the Second Intermediate Period wave of migration, and we know that because he entered at the time when the chariot was established in Egypt, and we find that in the book of Genesis. And this means that when Joseph entered Egypt, it had to be around the beginning of the 15th dynasty, circa around 1666 BC.
It's called the Ben Hassan painting. It's in a pharaoh's tomb from the 1800s BC.
Ooh. And then he repeats the mistake that this is a pharaoh's tomb. This is so bad. So bad. But it's all because he's repeating this mistake too. This is not a slip of the tongue. This is Frank Turek genuinely not understanding the material.
Now, the second line of evidence is that they found Jacob L. scarabs, which dated between about 1800 BC and 1600 BC across Egypt, Canaan, and Nubia, just during this period. And these scarabs the Egyptians used to seal contracts for official documents. They were also used as rings, jewelries, charms, idols. And 27 of these scarabs have been found with Jacob L on them, which probably means protected by God. And these scarabs, as I say, dated for about 200 years between 1800 and 1600 BC. We can't be sure if they are from the patriarch Jacob's household, but these do attest to the name Jacob in Egypt during the Hebrews' time in Egypt. So the person must have been very prominent. And this 1800 BC support.
None of the scarabs shown here are the Yaqub scarabs. The scarab on the left reads Neb Keperu Re, which is King Tutankhamun. The middle scarab is a heart scarab, so it's a scarab that was buried with a body. And the one on the right also doesn't read Yaqub. But it's more problematic than that. The Yaqub scarabs don't actually read Yaqub El, but Yaqub Hor. Horus is help. It used to be thought that these scarabs use the El name. However, it is now recognized that most use a Horus name, Horus being the Egyptian god of kingship. Furthermore, these scarabs date to the late 14th dynasty, or possibly the early 15th, which places them in the early 17th century. This would be more than 100 years after what Turek is suggesting is the time the Israelites entered Egypt.
It's an early Exodus date because if you go about 400 years from 1800 BC, of course, you're at 1400 BC.
Turek here is using the Masoretic text reading of Exodus 12:40 to conclude that the 1800 BC minus 430 years brings you to 1446 BC. Now, this is a little bit sloppy. First, according to Galatians 3:17, the 430 years began with the promise given to Abraham in Canaan. Second, according to the genealogy in Exodus 6 of Moses, the Israelites' time in Egypt could be no more than 350 years. Third, the Ipuwer scarabs don't date to 1800 BC. That's kind of wishful thinking.
And there is another view on the date of the Exodus for those that believe the Exodus actually happened. And the other view is a late date, which says comes from the 1200s BC. The date that Titus Kennedy and other archaeologists who are more conservative in nature support is the 1400s BC, particularly 1446, due to the biblical data and the archaeological data.
Whoa there, pony boy. Don't start throwing around that conservative and liberal label gratuitously, okay? That's just vicious rhetoric. The late date is the conservative position. The early date is not the traditional position. It was first proposed by James Orr in 1906. The late date long predates the early date position. And this is sort of a lie that early daters keep trotting out, is that, oh, you know, the late daters, they're vicious liberals. The early daters, well, we're the conservatives. No, dude, it's the other way around. The early date is the Johnny-come-lately position. Okay? And by no means does the archaeological data support the early date. That's just crazy talk.
So that's the second line of evidence the Hebrews were in Egypt prior to 1446 BC. Now, the third line of evidence, and let me read a passage of scripture before we get into this. Here's what this passage says. It has to do with Semitic slaves. And this is from Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 to 13. It says this, "Now Joseph and all that generation died. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt." You remember, of course, the story of Joseph. He was placed in a very high position in Egypt after he was sold into slavery. He interpreted the Pharaoh's dream and was, of course, promoted. But now this is after Joseph. Joseph has died, and the Pharaoh, the king that knew Joseph, is long gone. And so the passage here says that the new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power. And this new king, this new Pharaoh, said, "Look, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they must put slave masters over them to suppress them with forced labor, and they wanted to work them ruthlessly." This is according to Exodus chapter 1. Do we have evidence that these Hebrews actually were slaves in Egypt about this time?
Yes, there is evidence that the Israelites were made slaves, but that evidence comes during the conquest of Avaris in circa 1530 BC. And we find that mentioned in the biography of Ahmose, son of Abana.
Yes, we have evidence. It's called Papyrus Brooklyn. Papyrus.
Oh, my bun. No. Kill me now. This is painful.
there's something, a document out there called Papyrus Brooklyn, and it's from the 17th century BC. Now,
Okay, Papyrus Brooklyn 35.1446 is not 17th century. It's an early 13th dynasty text that dates between the late 19th to mid 18th centuries. It's part of a corpus of Middle Kingdom texts that all date between Dynasty 12 and early Dynasty 13. Now, you have to be on crack to date any of these texts later than that.
why is it called Brooklyn? Because it's actually resides in Brooklyn, New York right now. That's not where, of course, it originated, but it came out of Egypt. And what this papyrus does is it lists slaves and servants in Egypt, and many of them are Hebrew names. It's dated to the 17th century BC. And this locates the Israelites in slavery or a servant class in Egypt after Joseph.
Oh, this is so painful. Joseph cannot be before the Brooklyn Papyrus, because the Brooklyn Papyrus dates to before the chariot. Okay? Wow. Moreover, these are not Hebrew names. They are Semitic names. Semitic names are used by the Israelites. But just because the Israelites use Semitic names, it doesn't mean that those names are unique to the Israelites. This is just pig ignorance par excellence.
In any event, also another name you might recognize, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, Asher, is in this list. So is Issachar. So is Menahem. These are some of the names that you find in Papyrus Brooklyn from the 17th century BC, pointing out that, yes, there were Hebrew slaves. This is a slave list. Hebrew slaves in Egypt at the time that the book of Exodus says they should have been there.
Okay, these names are not unique to the Israelites. Asher is a common Semitic word that means happy or blessed, and it's found in the Mari texts. As for Issachar, that remains a controversial identification. Papyrus Brooklyn contains the names Sekeratu, Imsekeru, and Sekerwepti. Whether any of these names translate to Issachar is anyone's guess, but I wouldn't want to hang an apologetic on such a dubious identification. As for Menachem, that is also a name that's found in other Semitic languages, such as Ugaritic and on Ammonite seals. So none of these names are distinctly Israelite. So Turek here has overstated his case. There is nothing to suggest that any of these slaves were Israelite. And he commits a kind of anachronistic fallacy here. It's kind of like saying, my name is David, and I am a Canadian. Therefore, everyone named David is a Canadian. It's woolly thinking. And apologists should be on the guard against this sort of woolly thinking.
Discovery number 4 that shows that the Hebrews were in the land prior to 1446 is the fact that Semitic slaves were found in a tomb painting. And let me read a passage from Exodus to point this out. This is from Exodus chapter 5, verses 6 to 8. It says, that day Pharaoh gave his order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. And here's what Pharaoh said. You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Right, before we go any further, let me point this out that, Moses has been coming to Pharaoh, say, let my people go. And as you know, Pharaoh hardened his heart, which, as we'll see later, actually is evidence that Moses knew the Egyptian culture and the Egyptian theology. But Pharaoh is doubling down on his hardened heart where he says this to the people: you are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. He says to his masters who are enslaving the Hebrews, don't give them any straw. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they're crying out. Let us go and sacrifice to our God. So Pharaoh is saying, look, they're lazy. They just want to go sacrifice to their God. I'm not even good. I used to give them straw for the bricks. No more. They're going to have to find their own straw, but they still got to make as many bricks as before. The quota doesn't change. Now, if you go down to Luxor, modern day Thebes, as we'll go in a week or two, you're going to find a tomb.
All right. Dude, you got that backwards. It's not Luxor, modern day Thebes, but Thebes, modern day Luxor. Luxor is the name of the modern cities on the east bank of the Nile. Good grief, someone shoot me.
It's the tomb of Rekhmire.
No! 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 It's not Rekhmire. No! It's Rekhmire. Say it with me. 3 syllables. Rekhmire. Rekhmire. Not Rekhmire. Good grief, but he's going to show you all the evidence from Egypt. Oh, that'll be fun. You'll learn all sorts of crazy stuff. Nice. Rekhmire. Well, I learned something new. That's not a compliment.
This is dated to the time of Thutmose III, around 1450 BC. Thutmose III was the pharaoh before the pharaoh of the Exodus, and he had a 54-year reign. And Thutmose, at this time, this painting in this tomb of Rekhmire portrays Egyptian-specific brickmaking. They are baking mud bricks with straw formed into a mold. And this is exactly what, of course, Exodus says. It supports the biblical description of Egyptian brickmaking. In the painting, you also see these masters essentially abusing the slaves, hitting the slave with some kind of stick. Because Egypt relied on slave labor for their vast construction projects. And this aligns, of course, with the biblical picture of Egyptian slavery, chattel slavery. This is race.
Okay, a small point here. Egyptian slavery was not always chattel slavery. With state-owned slaves, unlike chattel slavery, where the entirety of the slave's output went to the slave's owners, state-owned slaves had to fulfill a work quota put upon them. And any labor above that quota was the property of the slave. Now, the Egyptians did this because it shifted the responsibility of these de facto slaves to feed themselves. The Israelites were essentially state-owned slaves. They worked their shift, then had to use other members of their families to raise sheep and work the fields to feed the family. The government did not provide a food stipend for these slaves. That was the slave's responsibility. Now, in this scene in Theban Tomb 100, which is the tomb of Rekhmire, these are Semitic Asiatics that are making bricks. However, we cannot be sure these are Israelites. Suffice it to say that Semitic Asiatics were often seen as specialists at making mud bricks. So there had been throughout the history of Egypt to make bricks, from the 5th dynasty onward.
Base human property. Because you were a Hebrew, you were a slave.
This is an anachronistic fallacy. Slavery in Egypt was not race-based. There were Semitic Asiatics who were not enslaved, and some of them rose to the very heights of Egyptian power. We know of at least 2 Semitic Asiatics, not including Joseph, who became viziers under the Egyptian system: Apparel and Bey. This is superimposing the racial dynamic of American slavery over Egyptian slavery, and the 2 systems are simply not the same.
In Egypt, and this painting, which is called Labor Master Beating a Slave.
Okay, this painting has no name. This is a copy of a tomb painting done by Endegaris Davis, and the publisher put a title on the copy. The original painting has no name. This is just stupid.
In the tomb of Rekhmire comes from 1450 BC. This is just...
Rekhmire was a vizier for Tutmosis III and Amenhotep II. And there's now no doubt that Rekhmire survived into the reign of Amenhotep II. This means he was still alive in 1426 BC, which is the year Amenhotep II took the throne. So, this tomb was not used in 1450, but more than 25 years later.
4 years prior to the Exodus.
No, it's 20 years after the early Exodus date. Another early Exodus fail.
So again, this comes from Egypt. Again, circumstantial evidence, but it's evidence that you've got the Hebrews being abused by what appears to be these slave masters in Egypt at just the right time.
This is total baloney. Turek has nothing to show that these people were Hebrews. Sure, they are Semitic Asiatics, but not all Semitic Asiatics are Hebrews. This sloppy garbage is why atheists mock us. There is a complete lack of rigor here. This is the sort of hogwash I would have expected from a $1 apologist, not someone as esteemed as Turek. This is an instance where Frank needs to do better.
Discovery number 5. There were, as we just read, the Pharaoh said, hey, you're going to have the same quota. Well, discovery number 5 shows that in Egypt, they actually did have brick making quotas. And this is something called the Louvre leather roll, because it's in the Louvre now, a museum, as you know, in Paris. And it shows brick making quotas in Egypt. And if they lacked materials to meet the quota, the slaves could still be punished for it. And this Louvre leather roll comes from 1274 BC, and it corroborates the brick-making process, the quotas, and the abuse.
1274 BC. That's very interesting. I'm surprised you showed this. 1274 is long after the so-called early Exodus dating. This leather roll does indeed show that Semitic Asiatics were being mistreated right up to the late Exodus date in 1265 BC. Interesting. Very interesting.
All right, how about discovery number 6? You say, Frank, we're going to get to 8, and you're already at number 6. Yeah, well, 6 is going to take a little while because it has to do with the plagues on Egypt. There's evidence from Egypt that these plagues took place, and there's also evidence from the Egyptian pantheon of gods that shows that the writers of Exodus knew Egyptian theology. First of all, let's read from Exodus. This is Exodus chapter 12 and verse 12. It says, on that same night, this is dealing with the Passover, On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. So this is the 10th plague. We're gonna go back to plague number 1, but I'm just leading off here with the 10th plague because of the phrase in Exodus 12:12, I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt.
Okay, this is sloppy exegesis. The final plague is upon the gods of Egypt, but only this plague is designated as being against the gods. Now, whether that is to the spirit critters who supported this Egyptian system of religion, or the men of power, is a matter of no small debate. However, no other plague is said to be against the gods of Egypt. This was an empty speculation by Currid, and evangelicals like Turek just seem to run with it without realizing that it is a defunct theory.
Let me say this right now up front, that the plagues were not random catastrophes on Pharaoh and his people. The plagues were judgment on all the gods of Egypt, because each one of the plagues appears to be a slam, a judgment on the gods that the Egyptians worshipped.
And this is why Turek is utterly incompetent when handling the Egyptian material, and simply doesn't know what he is talking about. He is almost the last person who should be leading a tour to Egypt. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. And this is an example of terrifying stupidity.
Let's go through each one of these plagues, because when we go through them, you're going to go, wow, I didn't know that. I didn't realize this.
Wow, I didn't know that. I never realized this. I say that to students often. It's not a compliment. If some subject matter expert hears about something in his field and he doesn't recognize it, maybe it's just being made up from whole cloth. Just saying.
I didn't realize how specific these plagues were. Okay, turning the water to blood, turning the Nile to blood, was actually a judgment on the ram-headed god and protector of the Nile known as Khnum. And I mentioned earlier, Khnum-hotep II, one of the pharaohs. That pharaoh named himself after this ram-headed god and protector of the Nile. Well, this god, Khnum, obviously couldn't protect the Nile when he had to go up against Yahweh. Yahweh just turned the Nile to blood, which is a slam, obviously, on Khnum.
It is. When I think of the gods of the Nile, Khnum is the last deity I think of. I mean, normally when they do this courage shtick, they usually pick Happy, God of the Nile, to represent God of the Nile. I think this is the first time I've ever heard somebody suggest that Khnum was the protector of the Nile. In this instance. Wow, I did learn something new. Not a compliment. Okay. Khnum was not protector of the Nile. Now, Khnum controlled the inundation cycle, but he was not the protector or the god of the Nile. He was a creation deity. And he is best known for creating mankind on the potter's wheel. This video is so whacked. And again, Amenhotep II wasn't a pharaoh. Please, please stop this insanity. It's hurting me.
And there's actually corroboration for this in a papyrus from Egypt I'll get to later. The second plague was the plague of frogs. And the Egyptians, had a frog-headed goddess of childbirth and fertility called Heqet, Heqet. So if you're going to worship frogs, Yahweh says, oh, you want frogs? Sure, I'll send you frogs. Frogs were everywhere.
Okay. It's pronounced Heqet, not Heqet. It's with a Q or a K. Q is in Gaddafi, K is in Gaddafi. Heqet was not the goddess of childbirth. She was the goddess of magic. And nobody worshipped Heqet per se. There were no temples in Egypt dedicated to Heqet. Yeah, you'll occasionally find a shrine to Heqet in a temple, but there were no temples in Egypt dedicated to Heqet. She was seen as the underlying power that made magic work. So, she was not more or less a childbirth god per se, although magic was used in the childbirth process. So, but she was specifically the goddess of magic.
Because, again, according to Exodus 12:12, the plagues were a judgment on all the gods of Egypt.
Again, this is eisegesis. According to Exodus 12:12, the Passover judgment was specifically against the gods of Egypt, but no other plague of Egypt was said to be against the god of Egypt. Please, just read the text.
Plague number 3 was the gnats and the lice from the dust. And this is a judgment on Geb, G-E-B, the god of the earth or land that personifies the natural elements. And if you see this god, he always has a goose on his head for some reason, okay? So
the reason why Geb has a goose on his head is the rebus effect. Now, the word for goose is Geb. That's how a goose is pronounced in ancient Egyptian. Therefore, the goose tells the ancient viewer, using the Egyptian language, that this is the god Geb as opposed to any other god. But I think there's a problem here. Rather than just mock this, it would probably have served the viewer a lot better to try to establish why a goose was on Geb's head, rather than just mock it. It's a terrifying display of ignorance that doesn't help anybody.
The god of the earth and the land, who is in charge of the earth and the land and the natural elements, is overpowered by Yahweh, who sends gnats and lice right from the dust all over the place. In fact, you remember the magicians when they met Moses, when Moses could create life from the dust. They said, oh, this is the hand of God. We can't do this. Yeah, we can stun our snake and turn it into a staff and then unstun the snake and it turns back into a snake. But man, we can't create life from the dust. This is the hand of God. Well, Geb couldn't do so either, the god of the earth and the land, but Yahweh could. Yahweh could bring gnats or lice from the dust.
And the Egyptians never claimed that Geb could create life. Geb is not a creation deity. And Geb was never said to have created life from the ground. This is a complete misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what the Egyptians believed. Geb wasn't the power of the earth. Geb was the earth. Okay? He was the land. So if you're going to mock the Egyptian religion, and okay, that can be fair game, at least get it right. At least get it right, especially if you're trying to exegete the Bible from supposed claims that the Egyptians never made. It's not a good look. It's just not a good look.
Plague is the plague of flies. And this is a judgment on the beetle-headed god of creation and resurrection known as Khepri, Khepri. And this plague you can read about in Exodus chapter 8 as well.
What? I don't know where he got this from. Khepri has nothing to do with flies. Man. I don't know what he's smoking here, but it's some pretty good stuff. Scarabs are terrestrial beetles. What is the relationship here to flies? Turek doesn't explain why there is a connection here. He's just sort of asserting that Khepri is god of the flies, which I don't think anything in Egyptian religion that would suggest such a thing. So I don't think Turek here knows what he's talking about.
It's the plague on livestock. Now, Hathor is the sky goddess depicted as a woman, a cow, or a cow-headed woman. The feminine counterpart to Ra, the sun god.
Okay. Hathor is only tangentially a sky goddess. Okay. She's a goddess of the... She can be, at times, goddess of the rising sun. But that's her limit as sky goddess. That's it. Hathor is almost exclusively an agricultural fertility goddess. And her theology is very complicated. Sometimes she's represented as the consort to Ra. Sometimes she's made out to be the mother of Ra. And sometimes she's the daughter of Ra. Her theology and her religious history is very complex. So it behooves us to not oversimplify it in this way. Oh, please, someone shoot me.
And normally, if you see this depicted as a human being, this human being god, Hathor, will have a horned headdress. So if it's depicted as a woman, has a horned headdress. If it's depicted as a cow, same thing, horned headdress. By the way,
this solar disk with horns is commonly found on Hathor, but it also appears on other goddesses too, such as Isis and Amunet. So the horns with the solar disk is not exclusive to Hathor. When it's seen on that speckled cow in that way, it's usually a sign of Hathor, but this is by no means exclusive to the headdress itself is by no means exclusive to Hathor.
They did seem to worship this cow called Hathor, which might explain why when the Hebrews went to Mount Sinai, they created the golden calf. They're going back to their Egyptian habits of worshiping Hathor.
Okay, this is oversimplistic and bad exegesis. Why just do only one? Okay. The Egyptians had over 24 cow deities. Bovine worship was ubiquitous in the ancient Near East. But it is unlikely that the golden calf was Hathor. And the reason is because the biblical text states that the calf was a male calf. Now, I didn't think I'd have to give Turek the birds and the bees speech, but there are little boy calves, and they have outie bits, and there are little girl calves, and they have innie bits. The Israelites understood the difference between male and female cattle. The golden calf was a little boy cow, so it cannot be Hathor, who was explicitly a woman, a goddess. So it is much more likely that the golden calf was a reenactment of the son of Hassan myth.
But of course, Yahweh's stronger than Hathor. Yahweh can kill the livestock. And that plague, of course, is in Exodus chapter 9. The sixth plague is the plague of boils. And this was a judgment on the goddess of medicine and magic known as Isis, I-S-I-S. And she is depicted with a throne on her head, but apparently she's not strong enough to fend off boils. She can't heal boils. She can't ensure that the people of Egypt don't get boils, even though she's the goddess of medicine and magic. And so they get boils according to Exodus chapter 9. And therefore, Isis is judged by Yahweh.
Okay, David. Take deep breaths. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Remain calm. No, Isis is not the goddess of medicine and magic. Now, there were a lot of gods associated with sickness and healing in Egypt. Serket, Sekhmet, and Imhotep, but Isis wasn't among them. Isis is a funerary deity. Oh, and that throne on her head is the word Set, as in Eset. It's another linguistic marker to identify which goddess is being referred to here. Isis is a funerary goddess. Get your freaking facts straight.
The seventh plague is the plague of hail. And this is a judgment on the sky goddess, often depicted as the canopy of heaven, stretched across the sky, bearing the stars. And this god was known as Nut, N-U-T. Well, this god is supposed to...
It's Newt, not Nut. What a Philistine. Unbelievable.
ensure there's a canopy above us to protect us. But this God can't stand up to Yahweh, who apparently sends hail right through the canopy. So we've got stuff falling from the sky that hurts us. Where are you, oh great Nut? You can't save us. Yahweh is stronger than Nut. He sends hail, and Nut can do nothing about it. By the way, you'll see the goddess Nut with a water pot on her head.
Newt does not provide a canopy. She is the sky in Egyptian religion. This guy doesn't understand Egyptian religion at all. He's got absolutely no idea what he's talking about. And the water pot is the Egyptian word nu, which, when feminized, becomes newt. Brother.
The eighth plague is the plague of locusts, according to Exodus chapter 10. And this is a slam on the god of fertility, harvest, and vegetation known as Osiris, the god of the underworld. Thought that...
All right. Osiris is the god of the underworld, but not the god of fertility, harvest, and vegetation. Back in the 1960s, when fecundity interpretations were fashionable, it was thought that Osiris was a fertility deity because he was green. That is now considered to be obsolete scholarship. We now know that Osiris is green because he's displaying the effects of post-mortem marbling as god of the realm of the dead. Now, when a body dies, the skin turns a blackish green color. This is why you'll sometimes see Osiris portrayed as with black skin and sometimes with green skin. It's to show that post-mortem marbling, because he's mummified, he's dead.
Have taught people agriculture, and he's depicted as green with a hook staff and a distinct headdress called an atef, A-T-E-F. And if you're watching on the YouTube version of this, you can see the image of Osiris there. And, well, Osiris, you're the god of harvest? Man, the locusts have just eaten everything up. How come you can't stop it? Because you're not a true god. Yahweh's the true god.
And that might be a valid point if Osiris was actually considered a god of the harvest. Now again, Egypt did have harvest deities. Min was a harvest deity, Neper was a harvest deity, and so was Renenutet. Okay? However, this is the problem with current judgment of the gods theory. It has to force the gods of Egypt to play roles they were never actually ascribed to historically. It's bad Egyptology. It's bad history. And therefore, it's bad biblical exegesis. And it's sloppy and unacceptable.
The 9th plague is the plague of darkness. And you can read about this in Exodus chapter 10. And of course, this is a judgment, a slam, a takedown of one of the primary Egyptian gods known as Ra, the sun god, the central figure in sun worship. He's depicted with a bird head and a sun disk headdress. Ra is supposed to be a god, but Yahweh blots him out. The land went dark because Yahweh's in control, not Ra. Ra's a false god.
Why is Frank Turek shouting like he's an announcer for a baseball game? Isn't this supposed to be a presentation of evidence? What's the point of raising your voice here to stir people's emotions? I don't get it.
Then finally, as we mentioned, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. This is a judgment on the jackal-headed god of the dead called Anubis, A-N-U-B-I-S. And this jackal-headed god of the dead included funerary practices and embalming. The Lord of the dead. Well, he's not so much the Lord of the dead anymore because Yahweh's the Lord of the dead.
I can't believe this stupidity. How is this a judgment on Anubis? Really? Anubis doesn't control life or death, neither in Israelite religion nor Egyptian religion. Anubis is a funerary god that escorts the dead to the afterlife. That's it. Yes, he was involved in funerary practices because he was seen as needed to help the dead make it to the realm of the dead. But he was an escort, not a ruler. So, making him the god of the 10th plague makes no sense whatsoever.
Ladies and gentlemen, you see each one of these 10 gods, or I should say, 10 gods of Egypt. Each one of these plagues has some sort of association with the gods that the Egyptians worshipped.
Turek has not actually shown that there is an association between the plagues and the gods of Egypt. He has asserted an association, but assertions are not evidence. And I think that is the main problem with his point number 6, which is supposedly Yahweh challenging the gods of Egypt. But this is not actually a line of evidence at all. It's a modern interpretation superimposed over the biblical text, and then hyped up with emotion so that the listener overlooks the fact that this is not evidence. Evidence are statements of fact that support a claim. Theories are not evidence. Interpretations that are inherently subjective by their nature cannot be evidence. Turek's commitment to an ideology, and perhaps his friends, has caused him to lose sight of what really is evidence, even evidence in its most tangential form.
Again, this is why Exodus 12:12 says that I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. What is
proof texting? Wonderful. All right, let's read the text in context. And what we'll do here is we're going to actually read Exodus chapter 12, verses 11 to 13. Starting at verse 11, quote, "Now you shall eat it in this manner," and it's talking about the Passover meal, "with your loins girded, and your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be a sign for your houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." Okay, so from the context of the passage, this is the final plague. The Passover is the judgment upon the gods of Egypt, not all the plagues that preceded this point. Turek has torn the text out of its context to make Exodus 12:12 apply to all the prior plagues and to all the gods of Egypt as such, by being judgments with those other plagues. So then, this does raise a certain important question. If this is the firstborn of Egypt who are being killed in the Passover, that is the point of the story, who then are the gods of Egypt? Now, we have to be honest here. Killing the firstborn of Egypt will have no effect upon the gods of Egypt if the gods of Egypt were either spirit critters, basically spirits pretending to be gods, or fake or false gods, basically the inventions of man. Religion doesn't work that way.
That's not how the Force works.
Instead, the Passover is a judgment leveled against human beings. We get a sense of this from Exodus 4:16, when Yahweh tells Moses, quote, "Moreover, he shall speak for you to the people, and it shall come about that he shall be as a mouth for you, and you shall be like a god to him," end quote. The plain sense of the text is that a god is a being having control over life and death, like what is found in Psalm 82, when human judges are being called gods, but are also being judged as unjust human judges. A god is not just a powerful spirit critter, but it is any being that has the power within its sphere of influence. Because in the ancient Near Eastern context, any spirit critter from Yahweh Elohim down to the most impotent fell spirit could be called a god. And when all is said and done, we often fail to recognize that human beings are spirits too.
So that's the sixth line of evidence that the Hebrews were in Egypt prior to 1446 BC. Here's the seventh, and this is almost too amazing to believe. It's called the Ipuwer Papyrus. It appears to
Oh, good grief. It's pronounced Ipuwer, not Ipuwer. Please talk to a real Egyptologist before you do a video like this. There's a saying, if you're going to do a foolish thing, like defend the early Exodus date, Please, for the love of God, stop doing it in a foolish way. It makes us all look ignorant and stupid. Talk to an Egyptologist to at least get the pronunciation correct. You'll be doing all of us a favor.
Confirm the plagues. This is also called Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage. And the probable dates for this are anywhere between 1599 and 1300 BC, probably close.
Those dates are whacked. No credible Egyptologist dates the source of Ipuwer to 1599 to 1300 BC. Only Titus Kennedy dates Ipuwer to that period. And he's not an Egyptologist. This is a very fringe opinion. It's so far in left field you cannot get a radar fix on it. Most Egyptologists, including specialists on Ipuwer like Roland M. Marsh, will date the text of Ipuwer to the late 12th dynasty. That's circa 1940 to 1840 BC.
To 1300 BC, you're gonna say why, or at least after 1446. Why? Because it's uncanny what this papyrus says. It's from Egypt, and it seems to be referring to the plagues of Egypt.
That's the fallacy of cosmetic similarities. Okay? Now, the Ipuwer Papyrus does refer to hypernatural events that took place during the First Intermediate Period. Those events were the result of the Nile inundation, but were for some reason naturally amplified in those years. Ipuwer itself is not based directly upon the biblical plagues. The text is way too early to be influenced by the Exodus. Yet, it does appear that similar occurrences seem to have taken place again during the 19th dynasty.
It's a chaos epic and a lament for Egypt written by a poet named Ipuwer, Ipuwer. And
it's not Ipuwer. It's Ipuwer. Ipuwer. That's Ipuwer. This is so cringe.
And it's addressed to the All-Lord, and it's describing, among other things, the plagues of Egypt. And this is the only surviving copy. It dates to 1300 BC at the earliest, according to Titus Kennedy. Now, there are people that will date it much earlier because they're trying to avoid the overlap with the Exodus plagues, but archaeologist Titus Kennedy, who we've had on this program many times before, and others claim, no, the date is somewhere between the 16th and 14th century BC, probably closer to the 14th century BC. And
Titus Kennedy is incompetent. He doesn't read Egyptian. He doesn't understand the history of the Egyptian language. He's in no position to redate the Ipuwer Papyrus. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And no, we are not trying to avoid the overlap with the Exodus plagues. Turek here doesn't seem to understand the difference between dating a copy and dating the original text. The copy of Ipuwer dates to the time of Ramses II. That too is kind of telling. But the original text dates to the late 12th dynasty. That dating is based upon the Middle Egyptian syntax found in the text, as well as cultural identifiers that peg the text to the Middle Kingdom. For example, the building of pyramids. There were no pyramids built in Egypt after King Ahmose, first king of Dynasty 18. But Titus Kennedy is not an Egyptologist. He cannot read Egyptian, he has no training in textual criticism, and the result is foolishness like this. And there are no other scholars than Kennedy that date the source for Ipuwer that late. Kennedy is an extreme fringe outlier here. This analysis of Ipuwer is so bad that Kennedy could only get it published in Bible and Spade. That's the Associates for Biblical Research's, ABR's, magazine. You can pretty much be assured that no competent Egyptologist peer-reviewed his paper prior to publication.
You'll see why here in a minute. Here's what Exodus 7:20 and verse 24 says. This is verse 20 and verse 24. Moses struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water, but they could not drink the water of the river. And here is what the Ipuwer Papyrus says about this. The river is blood, yet men drink of it. One thirsts for water. Exodus 7:19 says, blood will be everywhere in Egypt. Do you know what the Ipuwer Papyrus says? Ipuwer Papyrus says, pestilence is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. Death is not lacking.
All that shows is that the same hypernatural events occurred more than once. So what? I still don't see how this helps Turek's early date hypothesis. You have to basically take the Ipuwer Papyrus, rip it out of its historical context, and shove it into another context to make this work. And that's just bad methodology, bad history, and it's bad evidence. So I just, it's a lack of rigor here that just really is driving me nuts about this.
Exodus 9:3 says, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys, and camels, and on your cattle, sheep, and goats. Here's what the Ipuwer Papyrus says. Indeed, all animals, their hearts weep, cattle moan because of the state of the land. Exodus 9:24 says, and the hail struck down every plant of the field and broke every tree of the field. The Ipuwer Papyrus says, lo, trees are felled, branches stripped. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Okay, I'm not sure what trees being felled and branches stripped has to do with hail. And the Ipuwer Papyrus doesn't make that connection either. It seems that Turek is stretching this comparison to a ridiculous extreme.
By the way, that would make them arriving at Jericho in 1406 BC.
There is no evidence that Jericho was destroyed in 1406. And this is something that even several associates at ABR have now conceded the point on. We have evidence that Jericho was destroyed in either 1550 BC or 1220 BC. It should be pointed out that the only destruction layer from Hatzor that matches any of the potential destructions found at Jericho dates to around 1220 BC. So we have no destruction for 1406. Yes, guys like Bryant Wood have attempted to redate this, okay? But he's wrong, and as I said, even ABR has largely conceded that he was wrong on this point. So we've got nothing, absolutely nothing, to suggest that Jericho was destroyed in 1406.
Joshua and Jericho, that whole story. But the Exodus began in 1446 BC, according to the biblical dating. And we're giving evidence from Egypt that they were actually there. And as I say, we're about to go to Egypt and then Saudi Arabia for the real Mount Sinai. We believe it's the real Mount Sinai anyway, Jabal el-Lawz.
And here we descend into Crazyville. Ooh, ouch! The idea that the real Mount Sinai is Jebel el-Lawz was proposed by Ron Wyatt, who was a con man, a fraud, and a false prophet extraordinaire. Anyone who thinks Jebel el-Lawz is Mount Sinai has no knowledge of archaeology and should not be leading a tour showing evidence for the Exodus. This is just full incompetence on display.
Right now, we're talking about something known as the Ipuwer Papyrus, which is a papyrus from Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC that seems to describe the plagues that are in the book of Exodus. Here is Exodus chapter 12, verses 35 to 36. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So as they're leaving town, the Hebrews are asking the Egyptians for gold and silver and clothing, and the Egyptians say, okay, you can have it, go. Well,
again, how is this evidence? Does Turek even understand what evidence is?
The Ipuwer Papyrus says this: gold, silver, malachite, and a number of other precious stones and metals, bronze, are fastened on the neck of female slaves. Poor men have become owners of wealth, and he who could not make sandals for himself is now a possessor of riches, unquote.
Okay. First, it's malachite, not malachite. Oh, that's so bad. Because that's not even Egyptian. That's English. My producer here is groaning. I don't know how he could have butchered malachite, but he did. Malachite. Okay. The second thing is, this passage from Ipuwer describes the inversion of Egyptian society, which is a very common theme in Middle Kingdom political rhetoric. Slaves become masters, the destitute have gold, princes are working the fields, dogs marrying cats, the whole social order is in upheaval. This is a really, really common theme in Middle Kingdom prophetic texts. So this actually doesn't peg the source text to the New Kingdom. It helps peg it to the Middle Kingdom, where this was seen as, well, you know, the old regime, the old 11th dynasty, let things go to heck in a woven basket. So the new bureaucracy is going to make all things right. Trust the government. But what Turek has done here is he's cherry-picked the data. He's cherry-picked something that has a cosmetic similarity with the book of Exodus. But that doesn't mean it comes from the Exodus. It's mistaking similarity for ontology. So this is just really, really bad thinking. It's logically fallacious, and it's terribly cringe on top of it all.
Also, in the Ipuwer Papyrus, after God blots out the sun, you can read Exodus chapter 10. Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. The Ipuwer Papyrus confirms that. It says, quote, the land is without light, unquote. And then also in Exodus 10, it says this, Exodus 10:7. Pharaoh's officials said to him, how long will this man be a snare to us, meaning Moses? Let the people go so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined? So Pharaoh's advisors are essentially saying, let this guy go. He's killing us here, right? Well, the Ipuwer Papyrus says this, all is ruin indeed, that has perished, which yesterday was seen. In other words, yesterday things were alive, today they're dead.
This is so painful to watch. You cannot take an old text and redate it to centuries after the fact. And the worst part is that Turek is so confident about what he is saying. It's the bottom quartile of the Dunning-Kruger curve in overdrive.
In other words, the Ipuwer Papyrus laments the utter and sudden destruction of the land. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this seems beyond coincidence. Let me give you one more. Exodus 12, verse 30. It says this, and Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Here's the Ipuwer Papyrus. Groaning is throughout the land, mingled with laments. Lo, many dead are buried in the river. The stream is the grave. The tomb became a stream, and he who puts his brother in the ground is everywhere. Indeed, every dead person is a well-born man. Those who were Egyptians have become foreigners and are thrust aside. The children of princes are dashed against walls, unquote.
Now, the Ipuwer text here is describing the after effects of plague. And it describes water burial, which was done particularly during times of plague. But we have to understand that plague was not an infrequent occurrence in Egypt. It happened a lot. In fact, it happened so often that we really can't sort of narrow it down to a specific date because of this. So, again, it just happens so often. There are things in Egypt that happen frequently, like plague and famine. Those things happen frequently. This is also why we can't date the famine of Joseph. It happened too often to narrow it down to a specific period in time. And the same can be said for plagues. Plagues happen frequently in Egypt.
This is referring, it appears, to the 10th plague.
That is, again, the fallacy of cosmetic similarity. Cosmetic similarity is when you take two events or people and say, because there are features that are similar, they must be the same. You know, Moses had a beard. David had a beard. Same person, right? Faulty thinking. There are many cosmetic similarities that are found among the people and events in the ancient Near East that have no actual connection to each other. It is one of the most pernicious fallacies that circulates. You have to do more than show connections. It is imperative that one accounts for any counterfactuals that may arise. Say, the two texts date to different historical contexts. You gotta account for stuff like that. So before you can make those one-to-one comparisons, you have to show that there is historical propinquity between those particular contexts. That's just being a responsible historian.
The death of the firstborn. Well, what do we make of all this? Here's what Christopher Ames says. He's a writer. I believe this is from the Armstrong Institute. Yes, it is. It's a archaeology organization in Jerusalem. Here's what he says about this.
Christopher Eames is an early dater, but he's not an archaeologist, nor is he a subject matter expert in the field. He is a popularizer, and we have criticized his work when it comes to the Exodus. See the card above.
Quote, researchers simply don't know the original dating for this document, the Ipuwer Papyrus. It varies across a span of 6 centuries, and the latter end of the date spectrum may indeed align with the events of the Exodus. Remember, we said it's no later than 1300 BC. So that's what Christopher Eames is saying here. It aligns with the events of the Exodus.
Eames is relying on Kennedy's dating to stretch the authorship of the Ipuwer Papyrus to the 19th dynasty. This is a circular reference. Eames is quoting Kennedy, and now Turek is quoting Eames to prove Kennedy. This is sloppy and it just looks bad.
And as shown above, because he has gone through some of what we just went through, as shown above, both documents complement each other so well.
Back to the shouting. If you can't prove something by evidence, a raised voice will suffice.
A river that became blood, pestilence, crops, livestock, buildings devastated, fire and darkness, well-born offspring dying, lame duck magicians, slaves pillaging the riches of masters, and a shepherding people whose initial presence in the land culminated in cataclysm? How could this not refer to the same event?
Easy. It's at the wrong times. Turek started his video by saying you can find evidence, quote, if you know where to look and if you are looking at the right time, end quote. But Turek has picked the evidence he likes from across the span of Egyptian history. Apparently, when Turek does history, the dates don't matter. And his case for the early Exodus collapses into a mess of ad hoc reasoning because he won't stick to the parameters he established. Oh yeah, you look at the right time, you will find what you need. Until you don't, then dates don't matter anymore. And you can pull in whatever you want from any point in history and redate it as something convenient. That's just crazy talk. And it completely disrespects the essentials of foundational truth.
Apparently there is a gentleman who did his PhD dissertation. I don't have his name in front of me right now, but on the Ipuwer Papyrus. And he's like the biggest expert in the world on it. And he tries to say, literally, he tries to say this cannot be referring to the Exodus because the Exodus is fiction. That's literally what the guy said. In other words, he's bringing his philosophical bias to the Ipuwer Papyrus and says, well, they can't be the same thing because neither are historical events.
Okay, the man that Turek is quoting here is Roland Enmarsh. Now, I was a student of Enmarsh at the University of Liverpool. Enmarsh was also the internal examiner for my PhD dissertation. And Turek has expressed here a caricature of what Enmarsh has said. Enmarsh said that neither Ipuwer nor Exodus can be read absolutely literally, even if they describe historical events. Notice the wording here carefully. Can something be a historical event, but not described absolutely literally? Sure, it happens all the time. When you are dealing with hyperbole, there are literary constraints to what can be interpreted literally. Ipuwer is relating the events of the first intermediate period, but in hyperbolic terms. But even if the Exodus and Ipuwer both reported the same kind of natural event, as suggested by Kenneth Kitchen, Enmarsh suggests, quote, because such inundations very probably occurred on numerous occasions over Egypt's history, it would not, however, be possible, on this basis alone, to identify the two texts as describing the same actual event, end quote. Roland Enmarsh, The Reception of Ipuwer in the Ramesside Period, page 175. Essentially, Enmarsh is saying that these events happened often enough that you can't draw a one-to-one identification. So then, Enmarsh is not saying that the plagues of the Exodus did not happen. He's only saying that Ipuwer is not describing the plagues of the Exodus. That's not taking an anti-biblical position. That's reasonably assessing the two texts on their own merits.
Really? I don't think he's really looked into the evidence for this.
I don't think you're half as knowledgeable as you think you are. Take a cheap shot, receive a cheap shot.
As Christopher Imes says, how could this not refer to the same event?
Eames has become a dogmatic ideologue, as have many in the early Exodus date camp. It's not any different than those who say, how can the pyramids not have been made by ancient aliens? I just cannot imagine ancient humans having such technology that can cut stone. It's the poverty of imagination, and poverty of imagination is not evidence.
Okay, finally, line of evidence number 8. This is a fantastic one. In fact, it's found right between the paws of the Sphinx itself. Remember the passage we've been working from? On that same night, this is Exodus 12:12, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt.
More shouting.
Right between the paws of the Sphinx is a 10.5-foot stela, meaning a standing stone with writing on it. It's actually about 12 feet long, 12 feet high, I should say, 12 feet tall. It's called the Sphinx Dream Stela, and it tells of King Thutmose IV on a hunting trip, then resting by the Sphinx and having a vision or a dream. And it essentially said if he cleared the sand away from the Sphinx, the throne would be his. Okay, what does this have to do with anything? Well, scholars believe that this is a fabricated pretense to the throne. It suggests that he didn't have a natural claim to the throne. Well, who is Thutmose IV? Thutmose IV is the son of the pharaoh of the Exodus, Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II's firstborn son vanishes from history. And his next son turns out to be the pharaoh because this guy's brother, his older brother's gone, and he calls himself Thutmose IV.
Okay, again, so what? A lot of firstborn sons of the king never made it to the throne. The firstborn of Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, Amenhotep III, and Ramses II all predeceased their fathers. Much of this was because of youth mortality rates. This happened so frequently that this doesn't provide a good criteria for identifying the pharaoh of the Exodus. It's like when a witness says, quote, the perpetrator had a driver's license, end quote. So what? Hundreds of millions of people have driver's licenses. Likewise, many kings of Egypt did not have their firstborn sons succeed them. Also, the whole idea that Amenhotep II was king of the Exodus is in and of itself problematic, since he doesn't come to the throne until 1426. So that's going to be a chronological issue that I think is going to weigh heavily on this discussion as well.
After, I believe, his grandfather, Thutmose III, who is the guy who reigned 54 years. Well, why is he claiming that he had a dream and this dream gives him the throne?
That's easy. Egyptian royal succession is based upon being the son of the great queen. Not just any queen. For example, you couldn't be just the firstborn of a minor queen. You had to be the firstborn of the great queen. So, if you're not the son of the great queen, but the son of a minor queen, the path to succession could be contested. Thutmose IV was the son of a minor queen. He had to compete with the other sons of other minor queens. So he has to establish his position through prophetic visions and great deeds. Hence, upon taking the throne, he had the dream stela created and swept away sand from the Sphinx to secure his place on the throne.
Well, as Titus Kennedy puts it, he says this in his book, 101 Archaeological Discoveries. The Sphinx Dream Stela was
such a terrible book, too. Such a shoddy book.
Found between the paws of the Great Sphinx. And when the hieroglyphs were translated, it was found to be a personal yet official text of Pharaoh Thutmose IV, who reigned in the 15th century BC and was the son of Pharaoh Amenhotep II. It's an illustrative scene that appears at the top of the stela. It shows Thutmose IV making an offering to the Great Sphinx. And below, the stone inscription claims that while Thutmose IV was hunting one day, he rested near the Sphinx, fell asleep, had a dream in which the god of the Sphinx delivered a divine message to him. Allegedly, Thutmose IV was told that if he cleared the sand from around the Sphinx, he would be the pharaoh. He's essentially getting justification for being the pharaoh because he did not have a legitimate claim to the throne. His older brother did, but somehow his older brother is gone.
And when you can't prove your point, shout louder and longer.
What does this suggest? His older brother was killed in the 10th plague.
That's an empty conjecture. There's nothing that suggests that the older brother of Thutmose IV died in the 10th plague. Turek and Kennedy have nothing, absolutely nothing, to draw that conjecture upon. But this is the state of early Exodus rhetoric. Make sterile conjectures and hope people are too stupid to see there's nothing there.
Now he has to put up this big 12-foot high stela saying that he really is the true pharaoh. Why would he have to do this if he had an inherited right to the throne? He wouldn't have to do it. That's what many scholars are saying.
Thutmose IV had to do it because he had 20 other brothers who could have made a similar claim to the throne. He had a legitimate claim to the throne. And I don't know who these many other scholars are that he's talking about. I'm sure he hasn't read them. Okay? There's so many. It would be a good idea to name a few to show us that Thutmose IV didn't have a legitimate claim to the throne. Just saying. Okay? Nevertheless, this was normal when a succession path wasn't obvious. You could have a legitimate claim to the throne, and Thutmose IV had a legitimate claim to the throne. He just didn't have an obvious succession path because he wasn't the son of the great queen. Seti I had to do this, and so did Ramses II. And so did Amenhotep I, the guy who invented the prophetic literature genre that eventually gave rise to the Ipuwer Papyrus in the late 12th dynasty. Okay, so we're going to stop the video right here. Wow. This was bad. This was really, really bad. I mean, look, we've nitpicked this entire video, but it's not without reason. You have to get the little things right. You know, if you cannot get the little things right, like historical facts, who's going to trust you with the big things, like eternal destiny and theology? I used to work for a pharmaceutical company, and the FDA was obsessed with the company's paperwork. Now, you'd think, hey, you know, they're producing pharmaceuticals. They'd be more interested in the chemistry. But their attitude was, if you can't get the paperwork correct, which was the easy thing, why should we trust you to get the chemistry correct, the difficult thing? And they had a point. If you're sloppy on the small stuff, no one should trust you on the big stuff. Videos like Turek's treatment of the Exodus botches the small stuff, and it does it on a sweeping scale. That erodes trust for the bigger things, and a sufficiently erudite skeptic could use this to make all Christians look bad. It's better that we challenge this now in-house than to have a skeptic do it for us. So, anyway, we have covered just a crazy amount of ignorance here regarding ancient Egypt. We want to thank everyone for watching this. We hope you found this interesting and you learned something, and we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.